I never thought a single sentence could make an entire room feel like it stopped breathing, but that's exactly what happened the moment my wife smiled at her class reunion and said she had settled for me. The chandelier light inside the Grand Marlowe Hotel ballroom was soft and warm, bouncing off polished glasses and polished smiles, the kind of place where people pretend the past never aged them at all. I stood beside Jessica Miller, my wife of 8 years, adjusting the cuff of my shirt even though it didn't need adjusting, just something to do with my hands while the room slowly filled with voices I hadn't heard in decades. Around us were people she once called friends, old classmates from her university days, all dressed like they were still trying to impress each other even after life had already made its decisions for them. Jessica looked effortless in a deep blue dress, the kind of confidence she wore like it was natural, like she belonged anywhere she chose to stand, and I had learned over time to admire that about her even when I didn't fully understand it. I noticed a few people glancing at me, the polite kind of curiosity that comes when someone doesn't quite fit the frame of the picture, and I told myself it didn't matter, that I was just here because she wanted me here. Then the tone of the room shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, when a man stepped into the space near the center of the hall, someone I hadn't seen in years but immediately recognized from old stories Jessica used to tell in passing. David Carter. He looked composed in a way that didn't demand attention but somehow still received it, as if people naturally adjusted their focus around him without realizing it. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and instead of surprise or distance, there was something else there, something steady, almost like recognition without explanation. I didn't think much of it at first, not until Jessica laughed at something one of her old friends said and the conversation began circling around careers, achievements, and the strange way life reshapes expectations. That's when I heard her voice clearly cut through the noise, casual, almost playful at first, like she was sharing a harmless truth. She said she had settled for me, that I was safe, predictable, not the kind of man who ever really changed anything. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be, because it landed in all the wrong places at once. I remember feeling the glass in my hand grow heavier, not because I was angry, but because the air around me suddenly felt different, like I had been standing in one version of the room and everyone else had quietly stepped into another. I looked at Jessica, expecting maybe a glance that would soften what she had just said, but she was still smiling, still comfortable, like she hadn't just rewritten the way everyone saw me in a single breath. And then I noticed David again, still not speaking, still watching, with that same calm expression that didn't belong to someone who had just heard something surprising, but to someone who already knew how the story was going to end long before anyone else did. I did not respond right away. I just stood there holding the glass like it had suddenly become heavier than it should have been, listening to the soft hum of conversation slowly rebuild itself around the moment my wife had just reshaped my entire identity in front of people I barely knew anymore. Jessica was still smiling, still perfectly at ease, like she had not just placed a quiet label on me that everyone now seemed to understand without needing explanation. I noticed a few people glance at me again, not openly cruel, not openly kind, just the kind of glance people give when they are deciding where someone belongs in their mental map of the world. Jessica leaned slightly toward her old friends, her voice lighter now, as if she had already moved past what she said. She was talking about memories from school, about how people change, about how life rarely turns out the way anyone expects. That was when David Carter stepped a little closer into the circle, not interrupting, not forcing his way in, just naturally present as if the space had always included him. Someone joked about how long it had been since everyone last saw each other, and a few people laughed, including Jessica, but David did not laugh immediately. Instead, his eyes briefly shifted back to me, and there was that same calm expression, the kind that did not feel like curiosity anymore but something closer to understanding. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was reading too much into a simple reunion atmosphere, but something about the way he stood made it difficult to dismiss. Jessica continued speaking, now more relaxed, more confident, as if the earlier comment had already been absorbed into the natural flow of conversation. She mentioned how people settle into their lives, how some choices are made for comfort rather than passion, and again I felt that subtle weight in the air, like I was being described rather than included. I took a small sip from my glass, not because I wanted to drink, but because I needed something to occupy the silence forming inside me. That was when David finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, asking Jessica a simple question about what she remembered most from those years. It was harmless on the surface, but the way he asked it made Jessica pause for just a fraction longer than expected, like she was trying to decide how much of the truth was appropriate for the moment. I noticed then that no one else seemed to question him, no one challenged his presence, and that quiet detail started to sit differently in my mind. I looked around the room again, at people laughing, reconnecting, exchanging stories, and for the first time I realized I was not really part of any of it, not in the way Jessica was, not in the way David seemed to be without effort. And yet David kept glancing at me in between conversations, not with hostility, not with sympathy, but with a steady patience that felt like he was waiting for something I had not been told about yet. I could still feel the weight of Jessica's words hanging in the air, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had not needed to. The room had simply accepted it, like a quiet agreement no one bothered to challenge. I stayed where I was, half a step outside the circle, watching conversations continue as if nothing had fractured a few seconds earlier. Jessica was now laughing again, this time at something someone else had said, her posture relaxed, her attention fully returned to the people she wanted to impress. It was almost unsettling how easily she moved on, as if the version of me she had just described no longer required her attention at all. David Carter, however, did not move the same way. He remained just close enough to be part of the group but never fully absorbed into it, like someone observing a pattern others could not see. When someone asked him what he had been doing since college, he answered vaguely at first, mentioning consulting work and travel, but his tone carried a confidence that did not invite further questioning. Jessica leaned slightly toward him when he spoke, listening with more focus than she had given me all evening, and I noticed that subtle shift in her attention without needing to be told what it meant. I told myself it did not matter, that this was just how these gatherings worked, people gravitating toward whoever sounded the most interesting in the moment. But something about David's calm made it difficult to fully accept that explanation. He was not trying to impress anyone, yet the room seemed to adjust around him anyway. At one point, another former classmate mentioned success stories, comparing careers and life paths in a joking way, and Jessica added another comment about how people often end up settling for stability over excitement. She said it lightly, almost playfully, but the words landed in the same space as before, quietly reinforcing the version of me she had already introduced to everyone. I felt the need to step back slightly, not out of anger, but out of something harder to name, a kind of distance forming between me and the room itself. That was when David finally did something different. He did not raise his voice or interrupt the conversation, he simply turned his body slightly toward Jessica and asked her if she remembered the senior research project they worked on during their final year. The question was simple, almost casual, but Jessica paused longer than expected before answering. I noticed it immediately, that small delay, like she was searching through a memory she was not sure how to frame in front of everyone else. When she finally responded, her tone was lighter, but less certain, and for the first time I saw something flicker behind her confidence. David nodded once, as if he had already confirmed what he needed, and then shifted his attention briefly toward me again. There was no expression of triumph or judgment, only that same steady calm, as if he was observing a situation unfolding exactly as anticipated. I felt the room tighten slightly after that moment, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way people subtly recalibrate their awareness without admitting it. Jessica continued speaking, but her rhythm had changed slightly, as if she was now aware that something in the conversation had stopped being entirely one-sided. And I realized then that whatever David knew, it was not something he was in a hurry to reveal, but something he was already waiting for everyone else to catch up to. I noticed the shift in the room before anyone said another word. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was undeniable, like a subtle change in pressure that made every conversation feel slightly more deliberate. Jessica was still speaking, still smiling, still holding the attention of the people around her, but something about her rhythm had changed since David asked that question. It was small at first, just a fraction of hesitation between sentences, but once I noticed it, I could not stop noticing it. David remained calm, almost detached from the social flow, as if he was watching something unfold that he had already seen before. He did not interrupt again, he did not push, he simply existed within the space with an unusual level of patience that made others unconsciously adjust around him. I found myself paying more attention to him than to anyone else, even when I tried not to. At one point, Jessica laughed at a comment from one of her old friends, but her laughter did not carry the same ease as before. It sounded slightly more controlled, like she was aware of how she was being perceived. I took another slow sip from my glass, not because I wanted it, but because it gave me something to focus on while I tried to understand why the atmosphere felt different. Then David did something unexpected. He stepped slightly out of the circle, not leaving it, but repositioning himself so he was no longer part of the conversational center. His eyes moved across the room briefly, scanning faces, before returning to Jessica with the same steady expression. When he spoke again, it was not to the group, but directly to her, in a tone calm enough that only those nearby could hear clearly. He mentioned a name, a project, something from years ago that most people would have forgotten, but Jessica reacted instantly, just for a moment, her expression tightening before she quickly recovered. That reaction lasted less than a second, but it was enough to change the air between them. I saw it clearly, even if no one else seemed to register it. Jessica responded with a short explanation, trying to sound casual, but there was a subtle strain underneath her words now, like she was carefully constructing her sentences instead of speaking freely. David nodded once, not in approval or disagreement, but in confirmation, like he had just verified a detail in a larger picture only he could fully see. Around us, the reunion continued as normal, people laughing, glasses clinking, conversations overlapping, but I no longer felt fully inside that normality. It was as if I was standing slightly outside of it, watching layers I had not been aware of before slowly begin to separate. Jessica finally turned her attention back toward me for a brief moment, but her expression was different now, less certain than before, like she was recalculating something she had assumed was already settled. David did not look at me this time, but I could still feel his presence in the way he stood, calm and unshaken, as if the moment we were all living through was only one part of something much larger that had not yet been revealed. I began to understand that whatever was happening in front of me was not unfolding randomly, even if everyone else in the room still believed it was. Jessica had rejoined a small cluster of her old classmates, but her energy was no longer as effortless as before. She still smiled when appropriate, still responded when spoken to, yet there was a subtle hesitation between her reactions, like she was now aware of how closely she was being observed. I stayed slightly apart from her side, not intervening, not withdrawing completely, just existing in a space where I could see both her and David without being directly pulled into either direction. David Carter had not changed his posture since the last exchange. He remained calm, composed, almost distant from the emotional rhythm of the reunion, but his attention was not absent. It was selective, precise, and occasionally returned to Jessica at moments that felt intentional rather than casual. At one point, another guest mentioned a shared memory from university events, and Jessica responded quickly, but David followed immediately after with a small correction, not aggressive, not confrontational, just accurate. The correction itself was harmless, but the effect it had on Jessica was noticeable. Her smile tightened slightly before she adjusted her tone, as if she had to realign herself in real time. I noticed then that she was starting to monitor her own words more carefully whenever David was within earshot. The comfort she had carried at the beginning of the evening was slowly being replaced by something more controlled. I took another step back from the center of the group, allowing myself a clearer view of the entire room, and that was when I realized how much influence David seemed to have without ever asking for it. People naturally oriented themselves around him during pauses in conversation, not because he demanded attention, but because he seemed to understand when to remain silent in a way that made silence feel meaningful. Jessica, on the other hand, was still trying to maintain her earlier confidence, but I could see the strain now in the way she chose her words more deliberately. When she laughed again, it came a fraction too late, like she was matching a rhythm instead of leading it. David eventually spoke again, this time not to Jessica directly, but to the group, sharing a brief comment about how quickly people change after graduation. It was neutral on the surface, almost nostalgic, but I noticed Jessica watching him closely as he spoke, her expression no longer fully relaxed. After he finished, there was a brief silence that no one immediately filled, and in that silence, I felt a shift that was difficult to explain. It was not tension exactly, but awareness, like the room itself had started to acknowledge that something beneath the surface was beginning to move. Jessica eventually tried to steer the conversation back toward lighter topics, mentioning upcoming travel plans and familiar stories, but even then, I could sense that she was no longer entirely in control of the flow around her. David listened without interrupting, but his occasional glances toward me carried the same steady calm I had noticed earlier, as if he was tracking not just what was being said, but what was being revealed unintentionally through it. And I realized, standing there in that shifting atmosphere, that whatever history existed between them was not something I had been given access to yet, but something that was already shaping every interaction in ways no one else in the room fully understood. I started noticing that the silence between words had begun to carry more meaning than the words themselves. The reunion was still moving around us in its usual rhythm, glasses being refilled, chairs shifting, laughter rising and falling in waves, but I could no longer experience it the same way I had at the beginning of the night. Jessica was still trying to maintain her social ease, yet every time David Carter came into her line of sight, something subtle changed in her expression. It was not fear, not exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like she was adjusting herself to a version of reality she had not planned on confronting. I watched as she engaged in conversation with two of her former classmates, nodding at the right moments, smiling when expected, but her attention kept drifting back toward David without her fully realizing it. David, on the other hand, remained almost unchanged in demeanor, as if nothing in the room had the ability to unsettle him. He did not dominate conversations, did not attempt to draw attention, yet somehow the space around him felt structured by his presence. At one point, a guest mentioned an old university event, and David casually added a detail that no one else corrected, even though it slightly reframed the memory being shared. Jessica's reaction was immediate but contained. A brief pause, a tightening around her eyes, then a quick recovery into a smile that felt more rehearsed than before. I could see now that she was actively managing herself in a way she had not been earlier in the evening. The confidence she had displayed when we first arrived was no longer fully intact. It had become something she was consciously maintaining. I found myself studying David more carefully, trying to understand why his presence carried this quiet authority without any visible effort. He was not louder, not more animated, not more expressive than anyone else, yet the room responded to him in subtle ways, like people naturally adjusted their tone when he was near. Jessica eventually excused herself briefly from the group, stepping away toward the edge of the room, and I noticed David's gaze follow her for a moment before returning forward. That small movement carried more weight than anything he had said so far. When Jessica returned, she seemed slightly more composed again, but the ease she had earlier was no longer fully restored. Conversations around her continued, but her responses were now shorter, more measured, as if she was no longer speaking freely but evaluating each word before releasing it. David finally engaged in a longer exchange with another guest, speaking about career paths after graduation, and while the topic was ordinary, his perspective carried a calm certainty that made others listen more carefully than they realized. I remained where I was, observing both of them without interfering, and I began to understand that the reunion was no longer just a social gathering unfolding around me. It had become something layered beneath the surface, where history, recognition, and unspoken knowledge were quietly beginning to surface in ways that no one had fully acknowledged yet, and I had the unsettling sense that whatever truth was connected between Jessica and David was already in motion, even if no one had said it aloud. I could feel the atmosphere continuing to shift in ways that were becoming harder to ignore, even though nothing about the room itself had physically changed. The same chandeliers still cast their warm light across polished tables, the same conversations still layered over each other in soft waves, and the same music still played at a volume low enough to never interrupt the nostalgia. But between Jessica and David Carter, something had clearly settled into a different state, something quieter but far more intentional. Jessica had returned from her brief moment away, yet her posture now carried a subtle restraint, like she was carefully holding herself together in a way that had not been necessary earlier in the evening. She was still engaging with people, still smiling at appropriate moments, but the spontaneity in her reactions had been replaced by calculation. Every time David spoke within earshot, I noticed her attention sharpen, even when she tried to appear indifferent. David himself remained unchanged in outward appearance, yet his presence continued to influence the room in ways that did not require effort. He was now in a conversation with two other guests, discussing post-college transitions and early career decisions, and although the topic was ordinary, people seemed to listen more closely when he spoke, as if his words carried an unspoken authority that did not need explanation. I observed Jessica glance toward him more than once during that exchange, each time quickly redirecting her gaze as if she was trying not to reveal the fact that she was tracking him at all. The earlier confidence she had displayed when we first arrived had now fractured into something more controlled, something less natural. I stood slightly apart from both of them, no longer trying to interpret the reunion as a simple social event, because it was becoming increasingly clear that there were layers to this interaction that I had not been made aware of. At one point, David briefly excused himself from the conversation he was in and walked a few steps closer to where Jessica stood. He did not interrupt her, did not directly engage at first, but simply positioned himself within conversational distance, and that alone caused a subtle shift in her behavior. She paused mid-sentence with someone else, adjusted her tone, and then resumed speaking more carefully, as if aware that she was now being indirectly observed. I noticed that her laughter, when it came, was slightly delayed, as though she was matching it to the expectations of the moment rather than allowing it to arise naturally. David eventually spoke to her briefly, nothing confrontational, just a simple remark about how certain memories tend to feel different when revisited after many years. Jessica responded quickly, perhaps too quickly, and for a brief second her composure faltered before she corrected it. That small imperfection was enough to change the way I saw the dynamic between them. It was no longer just familiarity or coincidence. It felt like there was history present in the room that had not yet been acknowledged openly. As David stepped away again, I noticed Jessica exhale subtly, as if she had been holding something in without realizing it. She rejoined the group conversation almost immediately, but her energy did not fully return to what it had been at the start of the evening. Instead, she remained in a state of careful balance, as if trying to prevent something unspoken from surfacing. And as I watched both of them from a slight distance, I could not shake the growing sense that whatever connection existed between Jessica and David was not only real, but far more significant than anything anyone else in the room currently understood. I could no longer convince myself that what I was witnessing was just a coincidence of timing or personality. Something about the way David Carter moved through the room felt increasingly deliberate, as if every pause, every glance, every quiet interruption was placed with intention rather than habit. Jessica was still trying to maintain her social presence, still engaging with her old classmates, still participating in the reunion as if nothing beneath the surface had changed, but I could see the effort it now required her to stay consistent. Her responses were slightly more measured, her smiles slightly more controlled, and her attention constantly divided between the conversation in front of her and the awareness of where David was at any given moment. I remained near the edge of the gathering, no longer participating fully, only observing, and from that position the pattern became harder to ignore. David was no longer simply present, he was influencing the rhythm of the entire room without ever raising his voice or claiming attention. People naturally adjusted to his timing, pausing when he was silent, listening more carefully when he spoke, as if they were unconsciously recognizing authority that had not been formally introduced. At one point, Jessica laughed at something a former classmate said, but the sound felt slightly delayed, as if she had checked the room before allowing it. David, standing a few steps away, was speaking with another guest, yet I noticed his attention briefly shift toward her mid-conversation, and in that moment Jessica's expression changed almost imperceptibly, her posture tightening before she relaxed again. It was becoming clear that whatever existed between them was not being actively revealed, but carefully contained beneath every interaction. I watched as Jessica attempted to redirect the energy around her by bringing up shared memories from college, but even then her voice carried a subtle tension that had not been present earlier in the evening. David listened without interruption, but when he responded, his words seemed to subtly reframe what had just been said, not contradicting her directly, but shifting the context in a way that made her pause for a fraction longer than normal before replying. That pause was small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but once noticed, it became impossible to unsee. I began to realize that Jessica was no longer fully controlling her narrative in this space, she was reacting to it. The confidence she had walked in with had transformed into something more fragile, something that required constant maintenance to remain intact. David eventually moved slightly closer again, not intruding, but positioning himself within proximity that forced acknowledgement without words. Jessica's tone changed almost immediately when she addressed the group again, smoother but more cautious, as if recalibrating in real time. I found myself studying both of them in silence, trying to understand the origin of this unspoken imbalance, and the more I observed, the more it felt like I was witnessing a history that had never been fully resolved, only paused. And in that growing awareness, I began to suspect that the calm David carried was not indifference at all, but certainty about something everyone else in the room, including Jessica, was only now beginning to approach without realizing it. I could feel the room holding its breath in a way that no one was openly acknowledging, as if everyone was still pretending that nothing unusual was happening even though the atmosphere had clearly shifted beyond what could be ignored. Jessica was now speaking less freely than before, choosing her words with a level of caution that had not been present at the beginning of the evening, and I could see that she was increasingly aware of both David Carter's presence and the subtle way it affected her behavior. She was still trying to maintain her image in front of her old classmates, still smiling at appropriate moments, still participating in the conversations around her, but the ease she once had been replaced by something far more deliberate. David remained composed, neither aggressive nor overly expressive, yet his influence on the room continued to grow in a way that felt almost invisible to everyone except those paying close attention. When he spoke, people listened more carefully, and when he paused, others seemed to wait longer than necessary before filling the silence, as if unconsciously adjusting to his rhythm. I noticed Jessica's gaze drifting toward him again and again, even when she was actively engaged in conversation with others, and each time she seemed to correct herself slightly afterward, as if aware that her attention had been noticed even without words being exchanged. At one point, David and Jessica found themselves briefly aligned in the same conversational circle, and I could immediately sense a change in her posture, a subtle tightening that suggested she was no longer fully comfortable in her own narrative. David said something brief about how people tend to misremember certain parts of their past over time, and although the comment was casual in tone, Jessica responded more carefully than necessary, as if trying to avoid confirming or denying something specific. That moment lingered longer than expected, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of the silence it created afterward, a silence that no one immediately filled. I found myself observing not just what was being said, but what was being avoided, and the pattern was becoming clearer with every exchange. Jessica was no longer leading the direction of her interactions, she was reacting to them, adjusting in real time to a presence she could not fully control. David, on the other hand, remained steady, almost detached, but never disconnected, always positioned in a way that allowed him to observe without needing to intervene. I began to realize that his calmness was not passive at all, but intentional, as if he was allowing the situation to unfold at its own pace while already understanding where it was heading. The reunion around us continued as normal, filled with laughter and conversation, yet I could no longer separate the surface from what was happening beneath it. And in that growing awareness, I felt a quiet certainty forming that whatever history existed between Jessica and David was not something that had ended cleanly, but something that had simply remained unspoken until now, waiting for the right moment to resurface in ways none of us were fully prepared to control. I could feel the conversation around me slowly losing its illusion of randomness, as if every interaction in the room was beginning to align itself around something I could not yet fully see. Jessica was still engaged in the reunion, still participating in conversations, still maintaining the appearance of control, but there was now a noticeable precision in the way she moved through each exchange. She was no longer simply reacting socially. She was calculating timing, tone, and proximity, especially whenever David Carter was within her field of awareness. David, however, remained unchanged in demeanor, calm and unhurried, as though nothing in the room required his emotional adjustment. Yet his presence continued to influence the flow of attention without effort. Conversations near him slowed slightly, pauses became more deliberate, and even laughter seemed to arrive with a subtle delay, as if people were unconsciously synchronizing themselves to his rhythm. I noticed Jessica begin to speak less spontaneously, her sentences now structured in a way that suggested careful internal editing before they were released. It was not that she was uncomfortable in an obvious sense, but rather that she had become aware of being observed at a level she had not anticipated. At one point, David engaged in a brief exchange with another guest about professional transitions after graduation, and although the topic was ordinary, the way he spoke carried a quiet certainty that caused others to listen more intently than they intended. Jessica glanced toward him during that conversation, and when their eyes briefly aligned, I saw a subtle hesitation in her expression, a fraction of a second where her confidence seemed to recalibrate before returning. I began to understand that whatever history existed between them was not something being revealed through direct confrontation, but through accumulated micro-moments that were gradually reshaping the atmosphere of the entire room. David eventually shifted his position slightly, not moving closer in a noticeable way, but adjusting just enough to remain within the natural boundary of Jessica's awareness. The effect was immediate and subtle. Her tone changed slightly when she resumed speaking with others, becoming more measured, less fluid, as if she was now aware that her words might be interpreted beyond their immediate meaning. I found myself observing not only what was being said, but what was being withheld, and that distinction was becoming more important than the conversations themselves. The reunion continued around us with its surface-level energy intact, yet beneath it, an entirely different layer of interaction was unfolding, one built on recognition, restraint, and unspoken understanding. And as I stood there watching both Jessica and David navigate this invisible structure, I could not escape the growing realization that whatever connected them was not something from the distant past that had faded, but something still active in the present, quietly shaping every exchange without needing to be named. I realized at some point that silence in that room was no longer empty, it was structured, almost like it had weight and intention behind it. Jessica was still participating in the reunion, still maintaining the appearance of ease, but the way she spoke had changed again, becoming more deliberate, as if she was now aware that every word might carry a different interpretation depending on who was listening. David Carter had not changed his external behavior in any obvious way, yet his influence on the environment continued to grow in ways that were subtle but impossible to ignore once noticed. Conversations near him slowed slightly, pauses extended just long enough to feel intentional, and even casual laughter seemed to arrive with a slight delay, as though people were unconsciously adjusting themselves to his presence. Jessica's attention continued to drift toward him despite her efforts to remain engaged elsewhere, and each time it happened, I could see a brief internal correction, a small recalibration of expression before she returned to whatever she was saying. It was no longer a question of whether she noticed him. It was clear she was actively managing how she noticed him. David eventually engaged in a longer exchange with another guest about life paths after graduation, speaking in a calm and measured tone that never attempted to dominate the conversation, yet somehow guided it with quiet precision. Jessica listened from a distance within the same group, and when David made a small observation about how people often reinterpret their past depending on where they end up later in life, I saw her expression tighten for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a smile. That moment did not go unnoticed by me anymore, because it was becoming a pattern rather than an isolated reaction. I began to understand that whatever existed between them was not being expressed through direct confrontation, but through these repeated, controlled interruptions in emotional rhythm. David did not need to push or insist. His presence alone seemed to introduce uncertainty into Jessica's otherwise carefully maintained social confidence. She adjusted her tone again when responding to another friend moments later, slightly more careful, slightly less spontaneous, as if she was now aware that she was being interpreted on a level beyond simple conversation. I remained positioned slightly outside the center of the room, observing how the dynamic between them was reshaping not only their interactions but the energy of the entire gathering. Even those who were not directly involved seemed to sense a subtle shift, as conversations became more structured and less fluid whenever David was nearby. Jessica eventually paused during a conversation, briefly scanning the room before continuing, and I noticed that her composure required more maintenance than it had at the beginning of the evening. David, however, remained steady, never reacting with visible emotion, never attempting to claim attention, yet consistently positioned in a way that ensured he remained part of Jessica's awareness without forcing it. And as I stood there watching this quiet, unfolding imbalance, I could no longer dismiss the possibility that what I was witnessing was not a coincidence of social dynamics, but a long-standing history resurfacing in real time, one that neither Jessica nor David had fully spoken aloud, but both clearly understood in ways the rest of us did not. I could feel the evening slowly approaching a point where everything that had remained unspoken was beginning to press against the surface, even if no one had explicitly acknowledged it. The reunion around us was still continuing in its natural rhythm, but it no longer felt like a single unified experience. Instead, it felt divided into layers, with Jessica and David Carter occupying a layer beneath the surface that the rest of the room could not fully access. Jessica was still speaking with people, still smiling when expected, still maintaining the appearance of someone fully in control of her social environment, but I could see now that her attention was no longer evenly distributed. Every few moments, her eyes would subtly track David's position in the room, and each time she did, there was a brief hesitation in her expression, as if she was reminding herself not to react too openly. David, meanwhile, remained calm in a way that now felt less like neutrality and more like certainty. He did not seek attention, yet attention consistently returned to him. When he spoke, people naturally adjusted their focus, and when he paused, they seemed to wait longer than necessary before filling the silence, as though his presence had subtly redefined the rhythm of interaction. I noticed Jessica begin to respond differently whenever David was within range of her conversation. Her tone became more structured, her laughter slightly delayed, and her eye contact more carefully managed. It was no longer the effortless confidence she had displayed at the beginning of the evening. It had become something monitored, something actively maintained. At one point, David found himself once again in a conversational overlap with Jessica's group, and although he did not interrupt her directly, his presence alone seemed to alter the direction of what she was saying. She began speaking about past experiences from university, but I could see her choosing her words more cautiously, as if certain details required avoidance rather than expression. David responded with brief, calm remarks that did not challenge her openly, but subtly reframed the context of what she had said, creating small moments of silence that lingered just slightly longer than comfortable. Jessica filled those silences quickly, almost too quickly, as if she was trying to prevent any interpretation beyond her control. I found myself no longer observing just their interaction, but the structure of avoidance forming between them, like an invisible negotiation happening through timing rather than words. The rest of the room continued to function as if nothing unusual was occurring, yet even the surrounding conversation seemed to soften whenever David was nearby, as if people instinctively recognized a shift in atmosphere without understanding its source. Jessica eventually paused mid-conversation again, briefly scanning the room before continuing, and I noticed that her composure required more effort to sustain than before. David remained unchanged, his expression steady, his posture relaxed, yet his attention never fully detached from her. And in that growing imbalance, I began to understand that whatever history existed between them was not something that could remain hidden much longer, because it was already influencing every interaction in ways that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. I could feel the final stretch of the evening arriving not as a clear moment, but as a gradual tightening of everything that had been building since the first time Jessica spoke those words that changed the shape of how I saw myself in the room. The reunion was still moving around us, still pretending to be nothing more than old friends catching up on lost time, but the space between Jessica and David Carter had become something different entirely, something no longer hidden by casual conversation or social distraction. Jessica was now almost entirely focused on maintaining control of her own expression. Every smile felt measured, every response carefully timed, and every glance toward David carried the weight of awareness she could no longer fully suppress. David, on the other hand, remained steady in a way that now felt less like calm and more like inevitability, as if he had already accepted the outcome of everything unfolding around him long before anyone else had even recognized the pattern. At one point, the group around them began to slowly thin as conversations naturally drifted apart, and that was when Jessica found herself more exposed in the space, no longer buffered by the energy of multiple overlapping discussions. David took a slow step forward, not dramatic, not confrontational, but enough to bring him into a position where there was no longer any distance between acknowledgement and presence. The room did not react outwardly, yet I could sense a shift in attention, like people unconsciously sensing that something was about to resolve itself. Jessica looked at him directly now, and for the first time that evening, there was no attempt to disguise the tension in her expression. Whatever confidence she had carried earlier had been reduced to something more fragile, something that required effort to maintain. David spoke quietly, his voice measured and controlled, and although I could not hear every word clearly from where I stood, I saw enough in Jessica's reaction to understand that whatever he was saying was not new information to her. It was confirmation. Her response was immediate but restrained, as if she had prepared herself for this exact moment without knowing when it would arrive. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but the impact of it seemed to settle into the space between them like something irreversible had just been acknowledged. I found myself unable to look away, not because it was dramatic, but because it was finally coherent in a way that everything before it had not been. Jessica lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up with a composure that felt rebuilt rather than natural, and I could see now that she was no longer trying to maintain a version of herself for the room, but for this single interaction. David's expression did not change, but there was a clarity in his presence now that suggested the conversation had reached its intended point. Around them, the reunion continued its slow unraveling into smaller conversations and departures, but none of it felt relevant anymore. I realized then that I was no longer watching a social evening, but the final alignment of something that had been out of place for a long time finally settling into position. Jessica turned slightly as if preparing to rejoin the room, but her movement lacked the ease she had carried earlier in the night. David did not follow, did not pursue, did not add anything further, yet his stillness carried the weight of conclusion rather than hesitation. And as I stood there watching them separate into their respective distances within the same space, I understood that whatever truth had existed between them had not been revealed in a single moment, but had instead been present all along, quietly shaping every interaction until there was nothing left to hide.